Hi guys, welcome back. So in this video we are going to talk about climate change, and specifically we are going to talk about why the climate change is so important for us and why we need to focus on this topic. And there are some perfectly mixed pollutants, and we just regard the climate change as a global public good. And remember, the public good is non-excludable and non-rival. Those two characteristics just make this problem so challenging for us. And then I'm going to talk about the impacts of climate change on human activities and on land use. In the last part, I talk about some uncertainties to correct or to regulate the climate change. So from the first two graphs on the screen, we can see that both temperature and the global average sea level are increasing from 1850 to 2000. At the same time, the northern hemisphere snow cover is decreasing from 1920 to 2000. And from those three graphs, we see that we are facing climate change globally. And we need to focus on in most cases, we focus on carbon and other greenhouse gas. Why? Because those greenhouse gas are not well defined, are not well regulated in the market, and they are believed to a major driver of the climate change, of the climate variability, and there is evidence that carbon is tied to human or land use activity. So here are major sources of greenhouse gas. Most of them come from our electronic production and transportation, and our industry production, commercial and residential building. Agriculture just contributes just a little bit of the greenhouse gas. And then what makes the economics of climate change challenging? Why this problem, the climate change topic in economics, is very difficult to define and it's very hard to correct, to regulate. So first, let's see the climate change in economics. According to Stern Review on the economics of climate change, this problem is the biggest market failure the world has ever seen. On the other hand, that also means climate change or the greenhouse gas just causes so many externalities, and we don't know how much to value those externalities, and also how to identify all those externalities. And besides that, it is hard to find an incentive for an individual or a single country, a single group to contribute to solve the climate change problem, to reduce their greenhouse gas production. So due to those two reasons, it is a challenging problem. Also, it is very hard to identify a single source or a single origin of greenhouse gases, because any greenhouse gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide would just be mixed perfectly with others. So it would be very difficult for us to identify and correct any one of it. And that also means it requires global efforts, global international agreements to regulate the climate change, to regulate the greenhouse gases, not just agreements between us, a subset of countries. Also, effects of climate change would be different for different countries, for different areas, and it is very hard for us to identify the specific damage for a specific country or for a specific area. And then it would be very hard for the government to create incentive to correct the climate change because they don't know how to value the damage from the climate change. So accordingly, we just regard the climate change as a public good because it is non-rival and non-excludable. Remember, we discussed the definition of public good before. And if a good is rival and excludable, then we call that pure private good. So in our case, because we cannot exclude someone else from consuming the air from being affected by the temperature increase, so we can say the climate change is non-excludable. Also, it is non-rival because your consumption of air would not affect the air available for me to consume. Or we can say your enjoyment does not affect mine. So it is hard to generate agreement or cooperation. Kyoto Protocol was published in 1997 and entered into force in 2005. And there are two major parts from the Kyoto Protocol. The first one is that scientists, they just have an agreement that global warming is occurring. And the second part from Kyoto Protocol is that it is extremely likely that human-made CO2 emission have caused the global warming. So they want to control the global warming and take every country's efforts into consideration to control the global warming effectively. So it was their objective. However, it fails because the climate change is a public good and it is hard to measure everyone's incentive or each country's incentive to control it. So remember, we talked about the optimal pollution control level. So when we have marginal damage cost is equal to marginal abatement cost, then the total cost from damage and abatement are minimized. So that one, so the intersection is our optimal level or our optimal point, and the corresponding quantity of pollution or emission is our efficiency level of pollution or emission. So can we apply the same model to control the climate change? Unluckily, we cannot do that. So why? The most important reason is that the impacts of climate change are not marginal. So when we are analyzing this graph, we are talking about the linear marginal damage curve and the linear marginal abatement curve. However, in climate change, the impacts are not linear, and the marginal damages are based on cumulative effects or cumulative emission of greenhouse gases, or we can say the damages depend on the concentration of greenhouse gases rather than the flow. So we cannot apply the concept of marginal to analyze the climate change problem. And also, the mitigation or abatement efforts taken today would have effects in several decades, and it is almost impossible for us to measure the effects after several decades. Then we are going to talk about the impacts of climate change. So first, it has impact on agricultural productivity, sea level rise, human health and disease, and urban heat island. We would discuss agricultural productivity first. So there are positive effects and negative effects of climate change on the agricultural productivity. On the one hand, the higher temperature would result in faster growth rate, and then it would increase the yield because people can grow more. And on the other hand, warmer temperature can also lead the yield to lessen because seeds, they just do not have enough time to mature. And at the same time, agriculture also contributes to the climate change by increasing the temperature. The climate change also leads to sea level rise, and the most direct impact of global warming or climate change on land use might be the loss of coastal land. There are huge impacts on land use and human locations. For example, people have to relocate because of sea level rise, and currently there are 600 million live in coastal areas that are less than 10 meters above sea level, so that is very dangerous for them. They may need to relocate in several years because of sea level rise. So from those graphs, we can see the impacts of sea level rise on human activities. Let's see those houses or the housing markets. Because of sea level rise, we definitely need to relocate those housings. So that would be a huge damage, a huge loss for us. Then let's think about the causes for sea level rise. I add this slide because I think the reason for sea level rise is very interesting for me. I used to think the sea levels are rising because of melting sea ice. However, it's not the truth. Sea levels are rising because of land ice sliding into the ocean. When there is more ice, the ocean's ability to absorb solar radiation would decrease, and that would lead to the higher temperature. And according to this graph, with higher temperature, the water volume just increase, and that lead to sea level rise. Then we are going to talk about the increased temperature, the effect of increased temperature on human health. As temperatures increase, the spread of disease-carrying mosquitoes poses a major threat on human health. So we need to avoid that situation. And in addition, increase the rainfall just to provide additional breeding grounds for insects or disease-carrying creatures. And that means we need to design infrastructure to eliminate standing water after the rainfall. Water management would be a key focus for us. And then we are going to talk about urban heat island. Urban heat island is an effect where cities are warmer than the surrounding areas as a result of human activities. And remember, we talked before, human activities are a major source of increased temperature through the greenhouse gas emission. And another main cause of urban heat island is the absorption of heat by concrete and asphalt, which raises the nighttime temperatures, and it can be 8 to 12 degrees warmer than the surrounding area. There are also some negative effects from increased temperatures. Increasing temperatures may expand the areas experiencing urban heat island, and when the urban heat island expands, energy consumption would like to increase to provide additional air conditioning. Additional air conditioning would lead to more air pollution and at the same time, people living in the urban area have to pay more electronic bill, and they would be willing to settle further away from the urban area because they want to save some electronic bill. And some studies also show that the urban heat islands increased the frequency of intense rainfall events. Then we are going to talk about the policy response and human adaptation of the climate change. So there are two major types of human response. The first one is called mitigation, and the second one is adaptation. Mitigation is any attempt to prevent, slow, or alter the impacts of climate change. Adaptation is the process of adapting behavior and decisions to prepare for or respond to climate change. And comparing those two methods, adaptation is more important than mitigation. Why? Because adaptation reduces risk of climate change impacts. Because we are uncertain about the impacts, we don't know what the future would be. And it also allows us to take advantage of existing opportunities. It is consistent with sustainable development objectives, because we are not only caring about the environment, the climate change, we are also care about our economic activities. We want to survive, and we need some production, and we need the market, so we cannot stop us from polluting, from emissions of greenhouse gases. So that is the reason the adaptation is very important for us. And here are some specific activities under each method. For adaptation, we can modify zoning and the location of new development. For example, because of sea level rises, we need to relocate our new economic development, and we can change the infrastructure standard. We need to improve existing water quality to prepare the future changes. And for mitigation, first, there are some policies to control or to reduce transportation emission. Remember what we talked in pollution control methods. We can impose tax on polluters, and we can also impose cap and trade systems for pollution. And in that two ways, we can control or reduce a certain amount of the pollution. We can also specialize the land use to control the pollution. And here are just the two methods in the pollution control. The first one is a carbon tax, or we can say there would be another pollution tax for a specific pollutant. And the second one is transferable trade, or the cap and trade method. Polluters, they can trade their pollution permits, and in that way, the government can control the total amount of the pollution. But the problem is that we use environmental models to predict the damage caused by climate change, or to predict the cost to control the climate change. However, the results of those models may not be correct, because those models, they are depending on the weather patterns in the future, and we are uncertain about the weather patterns. So we need to be careful when using those results. And here is another factor that would affect our decision. Remember, when we talk about a dynamic problem, the discount rate is very important. The 1 million in 100 years is worth differently when we apply different discount rates. Suppose the discount rate is 5%. Then $1 million in 100 years is worth just $7,600 today. But if the discount rate is lower, which is equal to 3%, then $1 million in 100 years is worth much more today. So we need to be careful to pick a certain discount rate, and it is very hard for us to decide the discount rate. Why those money are very important for us? Because we are talking about the benefit and the cost of pollution control of climate change. And if the discount rate is high, then the total damage in the future, the present value of total damage occur in the future is so low, then there would be no incentive for people today to correct the climate trend, to correct the increase in temperature. So that is the reason the discount rate is very important for us. And because of the uncertain discount rate, there are so many uncertainties in damages and abatement costs. And that is another reason that we cannot use the damage and abatement cost analysis to analyze our climate change problem. Here I talk about some sources of damage uncertainty. You can check one by one, but in one word, I want to conclude that we need to take the heterogeneity into consideration, because the damage for different countries, for different areas, would be totally different. So we need to take that kind of possibility into consideration when we do the decisions or when we make the policies to correct the climate change problem. And the trend of temperature. The trend of temperature is very clear. It would increase in the future. But there are huge variations in temperature prediction, and therefore there are also some other uncertainties. It would be another source of uncertainties. We are uncertain about the exact weather pattern. So a key policy issue is whether we should act before the uncertainty is resolved. And we don't know the answer. So in conclusion, when we talk about the impact of climate change, the impact of increasing temperature, we need to take the heterogeneity in impacts in consideration. Because as I said before, the impacts of climate change would be different for different countries and for different areas, so spatial heterogeneity is very important. And for Ohio, we could actually be better off under global warming than we are now. So that's all for this video. See you next time.